State James Baker announces the long-awaited breakthrough in the Middle East peace process. With the Soviet foreign minister at his side, he invites Israel, the Arabs and the Palestinians to peace talks in Madrid this month. Good evening. It was an invitation like no other. Unprecedented Middle East peace talks, jointly sponsored by the United States and the Soviet Union, will start in Madrid on the 30th of October, with Israel meeting its Arab enemies face to face. Everyone involved is now expected to accept, although Israel's formal reply won't come until a cabinet meeting on Sunday. Presidents Bush and Gorbachev will fly to Madrid to welcome the delegates. But the US Secretary of State foresaw many problems, real gaps and suspicions that will not be easily overcome. Taking part in the International Peace Conference, James Baker, American Secretary of State, Boris Pankin, Soviet Foreign Minister, foreign ministers from the region, David Levy of Israel, Amir Moussa of Egypt, Farouk al-Shara of Syria, a representative from Lebanon, and joint representatives of the Palestinians and Jordanians. Also at the meeting, representatives of the European Community, observers from the United Nations, observers from the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. This group is expected to meet for a few days, with each party stating their basic position. It will then break up, leaving the real work to one-to-one meetings between Israel and each of its neighbors, a process which could take at least 3 years.
A very weary US Secretary of State sat with his Soviet counterpart at Jerusalem's King David Hotel. This was the end of 6 months of exhausting negotiations. Israel still hadn't given the formal yes reply, but in advance of the Israeli cabinet vote, both Mr. Baker and Boris Pankin were satisfied that the conference was on. That in itself was a surprise, and so was the location.
Foreign Minister Pankin and I are pleased to announce that President Bush and President Gorbachev are today inviting Israel, Arab states, and Palestinians to attend a Middle East peace conference to be held beginning October 30th in Madrid. That conference is to be followed by direct negotiations designed to achieve real peace.
Earlier, Mr. Pankin, with Israel's Foreign Minister David Levy, formally signed the renewal of diplomatic ties, a move which the Soviets have held back on for months and which has been conditional on Israel attending the peace conference. The announcement by Mr. Shamir, Mr. Baker beside him, that the Israeli decision would be made by the cabinet on Sunday initially appeared to be yet another stalling tactic in what has been a seemingly endless charade. It did emerge, though, that Mr. Shamir was happy with the terms and would recommend acceptance.
There are some questions that remained open. I will bring our conclusions, the conclusions of the discussions, before our government on one of its next sessions.
Mr. Baker's problem has been Palestinian representation. Jerusalem's best-known Arab leader, Faisal Husseini, can't go to the conference because the Israelis say he's in the PLO, and they won't talk to any Palestinians from the city anyway. So they gave Mr. Baker a list of 10 names whose PLO contacts are less obvious. In case the Americans were seen to support Israeli vetting, Mr. Baker didn't hand the list to Mr. Shamir. Such semantics have crippled progress in the past, but the Israelis got the names from elsewhere and seemed to be satisfied. Tonight, this reaction from one of the Palestinian delegation members.
We are part of the process, we are involved in the process, and we are keen to have a role and a place and a voice in this process.
Palestinians like these, who demonstrated with guns in the West Bank town of Jenin today, know that the Israelis have ruled out any territorial concessions. Israel is prepared to grant them limited autonomy along the lines of the Camp David Accords. Today's invitations to the conference say the aim is to give them at least that within a year. There will be those in the Israeli cabinet tonight who will be angered by Mr. Baker's decision to announce the conference in advance of their formal vote. But their decision now seems to be a formality. What they will discuss when they get to Madrid is another matter. The fact remains that on substance, Israel and its Arab neighbours remain as far apart as ever. Michael Macmillan, BBC News in Jerusalem.
Some Israeli government hardliners oppose even the discussion of peace in exchange for land. They believe that Israel is surrounded by aggressive neighbours and no compromise must be allowed to jeopardise the country's security. Here's our Foreign Affairs editor, John Simpson.
Well, welcome all to the White House.
For President Bush today, the summoning of the Middle East Conference was a foreign policy success, which no doubt outweighed all the problems he's gone through getting his nominee, Judge Clarence Thomas, sworn in to the American Supreme Court. His spokesman emphasized the high stakes everyone will be playing for in Madrid.
A just, lasting, and comprehensive settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict, to be achieved through a two-track approach of direct negotiations between Israel and the Arab states and Israel and the Palestinians based upon UN Security Council resolutions.
As for Mr. Gorbachev, as he signed a treaty of economic cooperation between 8 Soviet republics today, he must hope that the Middle East Conference will do something to help his abysmally low standing at home. For him to be sitting alongside Mr. Bush in Madrid will put extraordinary pressure on the Israelis and the Arabs to agree, hard though it is at present to foresee the precise grounds for such an agreement. The stumbling blocks are, after all, legion, starting with the Israeli settlements along the West Bank, built with the precise intention of ensuring that Israel will be there forever, and added to now with vigor so that the big influx of Russian Jews can be housed. There'll be no agreement if this question isn't dealt with. The Intifada has lost much of its vigor nowadays, but the bitterness it represents and the lives and property that have been wrecked will have to be set aside, together with the long list of mutual wrongs that Jews as well as Arabs can claim. Even now, an act of premeditated violence, if it was serious enough, could destroy the talks. For the Israelis, the question of their security is paramount. Any agreement will have to allay their fears of being attacked by their Arab neighbours. For it to be acceptable to the Arabs, Israel will have to trade the land it's captured from them in return for promises of peace. Yet Israel has so far refused to accept this. If it gives way, Israel's fragile coalition could collapse. And in Oxford this evening, Ariel Sharon, one of the hardest of government hardliners, was against any notion of compromise.
I'm all out for peace process, and I'm for solving the problems in the Middle East. But one thing which I will not accept is a situation that Israel has to pay that kind of price that we cannot pay.
And I hope that Israel will not obstruct this positive, constructive approach to a better cohabitation of the populations that happen to inhabit that tormented Middle Eastern area.
If there's genuine flexibility like that at Madrid, solutions can be found to every one of the intractable problems that'll be on the table. The Golan Heights can be demilitarized and returned to Syria. Parts or all of Jerusalem can be put under international control, and so on. History doesn't give many grounds for optimism, but then history can't show any parallel to the present situation. The collapse of Soviet power means that the United States no longer needs Israel in the way it once did. And Mr. Baker has been saying harder things to the Israelis in private than any American Secretary of State has ever said before. In Madrid, the extraordinary spectacle of the Soviet and American presidents sitting there together will certainly help the chances of success. But if that fails, it's hard to think that anything will ever succeed.
In Yugoslavia, the breakaway Republic of Croatia has experienced one of the worst days of fighting so far, despite calls by leaders on all sides for a 10th ceasefire. In Sisak, planes and artillery attacked an oil refinery for the second time this week. Osijek was battered by a mortar and rocket fire, and in Vukovar, the hospital was hit again as the Federal Army tightened its grip. The humanitarian group Médecins Sans Frontières will be allowed in tomorrow to evacuate the critically wounded.
From the ruins of the village of Nustar, their last outpost on the road to Vukovar, Croatian soldiers took cover against incoming mortar and artillery fire. And this is the country through which a convoy of ambulances is supposed to travel tomorrow in another attempt to rescue the 200 to 300 seriously wounded from the Croatian garrison in Vukovar. As so often at a time of peace talks, the fighting has intensified. Near Karlovac, a Croatian tank, one of the few, opening up on army positions. The oil refinery at Sisak, south of Zagreb, was hit, a regular target for the federal side, but this was one of the most damaging fires yet. And near Novska, 70 miles east of the capital, Croatian troops were weathering the second day of a sustained bombardment by the federal or Serbian side. The town itself was deserted, its remaining population in deep shelters, and smoke was rising over the ruins of the frontline village next to it. The town of Novska has been under concentrated bombardment by artillery, tanks and aircraft for all of the day. It seems part of a plan of attack right across the entire front, in which the ceasefire means nothing at all, and the federal army is seizing what ground it can. I don't believe in ceasefires, says this soldier. There have been so many of them, and the fighting is always greater afterwards because of their plan to take even more of Croatia. The eastern centre of Osijek suffered yet another mortar attack, and the danger was not only from the falling bombs, but from the confusion and chaos that these attacks still cause at street level. Yet it wasn't from Osijek, but to it that the refugees were streaming today. Croats from the town of Ilok and villages around it, invited to leave their homes by the army, which is to say expelled, in what they see as an attempt by the Serbs to redraw the map of Croatia. The situation is very bad, he says. At least 50 dead in every village, even more in some. All told, as grim a day as any in the 3.5 months of the war. But amid the gloom, Croatian soldiers in Karlovac did find time to celebrate the wedding of one of them. From among them, the only shots today that were not fired in anger. Martin Bell, BBC News, Croatia.
In The Hague, the European community presented the warring Yugoslav factions with a comprehensive plan for an end to the fighting. However, the Serbian leader, Slobodan Milosevic, has already rejected it as insufficient and contradictory. The plan proposes a looser federation of sovereign, independent republics, the recognition of existing borders, and wide-ranging guidelines for protecting minority human rights, such as the Serb population inside Croatia.
Delayed by the bad weather, the Yugoslav leaders arrived in The Hague for what had been described as a last chance for the peace conference. They've signed so many ceasefires in the past few weeks, all faith has been lost.
We know there have been 9 ceasefire agreements. President Gorbachev, or the Secretary General of the United Nations, and his special missionary, Mr. Vance, or the EC, or Lord Carrington, all have signed agreements on ceasefire. As such, with the parties in Yugoslavia, it still has not stopped.
And at today's meeting, the ritual was repeated. A 10th ceasefire was agreed and a message sent to Yugoslavia. Although the fighting didn't stop, the discussion continued, centering on new EC proposals for a political solution to the crisis. In a letter given to all parties, the EC says the ideas should be the basis for future negotiations. The document suggesting allowing Serbians living in some areas of Croatia a form of autonomy. But surrounded by journalists afterwards, the Serbian president, Slobodan Milosevic, gave it short shrift.
We don't think that it is enough.
Later, the conference chairman said Serbia objected because it wanted to keep the old Yugoslavia intact.
There was a reservation by one delegation, Serbia, on the grounds that the paper and those principles undercut the state of Yugoslavia as a whole and were illegal.
But here at the Dutch Foreign Ministry tonight, other Yugoslav republics have signalled interest in the EC ideas. The negotiating door is still open, but only just. Jonathan Charles, BBC News, The Hague.
Here, the High Court has found Cleveland County Council not guilty of racial discrimination in allowing a white mother to remove her child from a school with mainly Asian pupils. The judge said Parliament intended that the parents' right to choose their child's school is more important than race relations law.
The case began at this Middlesbrough infant school where 60% of children are Asian. Although teaching's in English, children did learn 3 nursery rhymes in Hindi. Unhappy about this, Jenny Carney asked to move her daughter Catrice to another school, where most pupils were white. She wrote saying, "I don't think it's right when she comes home singing in Pakistani. I just don't want her to learn this language." She added, "I don't think it's fair for her to go through school with just 4 white friends." Catrice's father is part African, and her parents denied their motives were racial, although parents don't have to give any reasons when requesting a school transfer. The Commission for Racial Equality brought the test case, claiming Cleveland Council had broken race relations law in allowing the change of schools. In his judgment, Mr. Justice McPherson said the Education Authority had not broken the law in allowing the girl to transfer schools. And on the wider issue, he said he believed the law intended that parents' choice should be met, even if parents' motives were discreditable. Mrs. Carney's solicitor welcomed the result.
Well, Miss Carney is delighted by the decision, which is a common-sense decision. It saves LEAs from becoming the thought police of education. It enshrines the primacy of parental preferences. It in no way condones any racial choice.
We support the freedom to choose, but what we don't support is the freedom to discriminate. And we think that what the judge has just said will oblige local education authorities to comply with requests for transfer on racial grounds, even though that's not a position education authorities themselves wish to be in.
The judge said the floodgates were unlikely to open on requests for school transfers, despite the Commission's fears. But Cleveland Council said they'd now be forced to comply with school transfer requests, even when they're made on explicitly racist grounds.
The government has reacted with annoyance to the European Commission's demand that work stops on 7 construction projects in Britain because of fears they may contravene a community environment directive. The Transport Secretary, Malcolm Rifkin, who received the EC instruction, described it as silly and puzzling. The schemes include an extension to the M3 through Twyford Down, the East London River crossing and the Channel Tunnel rail terminal at King's Cross.
Plans to extend the M3 motorway through Twyford Down in Hampshire have provoked strong opposition from those worried about the effects on the local environment. The European Commission is accusing Britain of failing to assess the environmental impact of this and other schemes in line with the European directive issued 3 years ago. Government sources argue that even with those schemes started before 1988, Britain did implement full environmental assessments. And despite claims that the government wasn't getting overly excited about the dispute, ministers showed signs of exasperation with the Commission.
Well, I think they should be perhaps consulting with governments and not simply listening to rumours and theories and reports. The Commissioner in his letter to me said that he'd heard reports about what we were or were not doing. If his office had consulted the Department of Transport, some of these problems and misunderstandings could have been very easily clarified.
If Mr. Rifkin doesn't wake up to legal reality and now frees all progress on these schemes, we will make an application to the High Court to try and get an injunction to restrain him. He's got to stop behaving like a juggernaut with blinkers and wake up to legal realities.
The European Commission has given Britain 2 months to reply to the request. If that doesn't resolve matters, the Commission could issue what's called a reasoned opinion. If matters were still unresolved in several months' time, the case could be referred to the European Court of Justice. But government sources insist it won't come to that.
This government signed this piece of legislation. It agreed to it. If it's a government that respects law, it should obey the law.
So I don't think we draw swords at this stage. We want to look at the detail of what's actually being proposed with the intention of ensuring that we do everything to guarantee the maximum cleanliness of our environment.
Less than 2 months away from the crucial European summit in Holland, some Conservatives are warning that Britain faces more meddling, as they see it, if she agrees to greater political and monetary union. The Commission's request has given them some ammunition, and John Major's effort to keep the boat steady has been dealt an unexpected blow.
Commonwealth leaders meeting in Zimbabwe have agreed to a phased lifting of sanctions against South Africa. The bans on cultural exchanges and sporting links will end immediately. The question of when trade and financial sanctions should be removed is still being discussed. From the summit meeting in Harare, James Robbins reports.
John Major was in the nets as the lifting of Commonwealth sports boycotts was finally confirmed. By way of celebration, the Prime Minister bowled out his press secretary. The Prime Minister was one of 6 heads of government and foreign ministers playing a charity game against young Zimbabweans. Relief after days of debate, ending as expected with the first Commonwealth concession to South Africa's political reforms. With Australia's Bob Hawke opening the batting, the 2 Prime Ministers quickly piled up the runs. Both leaders were determined to get South Africa back into world cricket and to force the pace on the lifting of trade and investment sanctions too. When they declared their innings over, John Major was on 5, Bob Hawke on 21.
Good match, good confidence.
The immediate lifting of so-called people-to-people sanctions goes further than sport. Zimbabweans queuing in Harare for visas to cross the border into South Africa should soon face much less bureaucracy. The end of cultural and academic boycotts will remove another aspect of South Africa's isolation. But still, John Major is going to the Commonwealth leaders' traditional weekend retreat, disputing the speed at which all other trade and financial sanctions should disappear. The Victoria Falls will be the spectacular backdrop for the leaders as they blend tourism with last-minute negotiation on the big conference declaration. Here at the Elephant Hills Hotel, they'll find buffalo peering at them from the trees, baboons beside the golf course, an enchanting atmosphere intended to produce something close to Commonwealth consensus after years of division. James Robbins, BBC News, Harare.
In Germany, leaders of the Jewish community are urging the government to do more to crack down on racial violence. There have been a growing number of attacks by neo-Nazis on immigrants and foreign workers. 700 incidents have been reported since August, as support for the extreme right wing grows, particularly among the unemployed in what was East Germany. At Hoyerswerda in the southeast, the police had to clear all foreigners from the town for their own protection.
To applause from local residents, immigrants bust out of the town of Hoyerswerda after repeated attacks on a hostel by neo-Nazis forced the police to move all the foreigners out. Hoyerswerda is seen as a great victory among neo-Nazi youths in nearby towns like Cottbus, a standard to aim for. These are members of the German Alternative Party preparing for their annual congress tomorrow. Most are now unemployed. Job security in East Germany went when the wall came down, and they fear competition from immigrants for scarce jobs. A receptive audience for a simple message not heard openly in Germany for 45 years.
The foreigners take away houses in Germany, bring drugs and all kinds of filth. They steal German workplaces and they filthy up the environment.
For me, now, the most important inspiration is Adolf Hitler.
Their leader, Frank Hubner, is running for election in the local council. Neo-Nazis recently shook the establishment, winning seats in Bremen in former West Germany, where attacks on foreigners are also increasing. Force backs the politics. The police seized more than 200 weapons when neo-Nazis gathered for a concert here in Cottbus, an armory of street warfare to attack foreigners and in defence against the left-wing gangs who constantly harass the neo-Nazis. There is hard work going on to stop the spread of the new right-wingers. School children are taught to respect foreigners in special lessons, but the propaganda of hate is powerful, and away from the classroom, some parrot the prejudices of their parents. Foreigners out, they say. Even the Russians were better. The communists have gone, but conventional politicians have failed to capture the imagination of people in what was East Germany, leaving an opening for the politicians of the new right. David Loyne, BBC News, Germany.
In the United States, the Senate Intelligence Committee has approved President Bush's nomination for the next head of the CIA. Robert Gates, who spent 20 years in the organization, had faced tough questioning, which included his role in the Iran-Contra scandal. Martin Sixsmith reports from Washington.
Mr. Glenn?
Aye.
Mr. Warner?
Despite all the controversy over Robert Gates' implication in the Iran-Contra scandal, the Senate Intelligence Committee moved surprisingly smoothly to approve his nomination.
11 yeas and 4 nays is the vote, and the nomination is reported favorably to the Senate. The committee stands in recess.
Gates was rejected as CIA director 4 years ago because of the Iranian arms for hostages deal. But this time he made a public admission of his past mistakes, and most senators were today prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt.
I believe that his own intelligence, his many years of experience in intelligence work, and what I trust he's learned in the course of 2 rough, tough confirmation processes qualifies him extremely well.
Iran-Contra and the collapse of Soviet communism, though, have thrown American intelligence into confusion. And Gates's opponents insist that he is not the man to put things right.
He's the wrong man for the job. The CIA is in disarray. The responsibility to fix it will be that of the next director of Central Intelligence.
Gates's enemies say his fierce anti-Soviet views are out of place now that communism has collapsed. And with the CIA's operations costing $18 billion a year, its next director will have to adapt it to a new role if calls for its disbandment are to be resisted.
The award-winning cameraman, whose pictures of the Ethiopian famine inspired the Band Aid charity appeals, has returned to work for the first time since he was badly injured in an explosion 4 months ago. Mohammed Amin lost part of his left arm while filming with the BBC in Ethiopia. But doctors have fitted a new electronic arm developed in the United States, and he's gone back to Africa to cover the Commonwealth Summit.
Mohammed Amin was told by doctors that he'd never operate a camera again. Undeterred, he asked an American firm to purpose-build an artificial electronic arm. Its controls were specially adapted and respond to pressure from Amin's upper arm muscles.
Just practice.
He spent weeks mastering the new technique and practiced by filming himself in a mirror. It's just 4 months since Mohammed Amin was badly injured and his sound recordist killed in Addis Ababa whilst taking these pictures of an ammunition dump explosion. Today, back at work for the first time, filming the Commonwealth Conference in Harare, he found John Major making a beeline for him.
How are you?
I'm very well.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you too, sir.
Are you fitting well now?
I'm fitting well. I've got a new arm now, and I can sort of...
How mobile is it?
It's fairly mobile. I mean, I can rotate my wrist in either direction and go right round.
Mohammed Amin says he's not cut out for a desk job, and with the versatility of his new arm,